Now for better typology, part 2, I am going to be talking about the second typology, which is typing the batterers by their generality of violence and psychopathologies. And there are also 3 groups in this one. But within this group 1, you can see that it contains 50% of all batterers. And usually these people cause violence to family more accidentally from impulse decisions. Like, for example, when people suddenly have a crisis due to low emotional control from anger issues, or the violence is tied to substance abuse. But most, if any, of the violence within this group only occurs within the family. And I guess a little fact to throw out there from page 113 about substance abuse while I'm on it is that 70% of abusers at the time of abuse were under the influence. And I feel like that's a big fact to know and see and understand, because it plays into a lot of violence, and it plays into a lot of predisposed violence too. But going on to the second group, this is the 25% of domestic abusers listed in this typology. These batterers, unlike the first group, don't stray away from sporadic violence inside and outside the home. These batterers at times can be linked to borderline personalities that are also associated by mood disorders. And on page 100, termed by Holtzworth Monroe, that he talks about the borderline / dysphoric and how they are dangerous and violent, and it's easily linked with easy to diagnose psychopathologies, including jealousy, paranoia, and other fear-based emotions that relate to the amygdala. But some other personality disorders that can be linked to it is also depression and anxiety, and it can usually get pretty complicated once all those things are mixed up together. But for group 3, this group is generally labeled as the generally violent / antisocial. This group is definitely more violent to the world at large. They even get a name in the book, Cobras. But people usually who have rage disorders and freely use violence or manipulation to control someone fall into this group. There's no percentage for the amount of people in this group, so it can usually vary. But I have that picture on the side to show how a lot of this stuff can weigh on somebody, and if someone's already predisposed to violence, it can just make it way worse for people around them, honestly. Now, next I'm going to be talking about psychological understanding with the family, the batterers, and external factors. For the first one, for external factors, the evolutionary neuroandrogenic theory, ENA, by Lee Ellis. It was created basically to make a connection between testosterone levels and violence. I feel like this is very important because there is a true correlation. I mean, the extra testosterone, it says in the book, can emphasize brain functioning in the right hemisphere, which is with risk-based calculations, and pulls away from using the left hemisphere, which is mainly based in logic and languages. And this link is associated with the constant firing of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the brain, which is basically the alert systems that enact the flight or fight to be constantly activated. And for people who are already predisposed to violence or anger issues or low patience, I guess you would say, there are times where flight or fight kicks in where it probably doesn't need to. And that's probably where a lot of the problems start. It's silly things that turn big because they can't solve the problem internally or even externally. Usually you find with a lot of people who are domestic violence abusers are very bad at being able to communicate. So it honestly all just kind of plays into each other. But next is the family feelings. I want to talk about high cortisol intake. there was a fact on page 106 that I found super important, and it was that we do know now that children who observe violence in their household, whether against them, their siblings, or their parents, have markedly higher rates of cortisol in their developing brains. These long-lasting effects of cortisol have a huge impact on the linkage between violence and cortisol for children, or predisposed violence. The prolonged exposure to this cortisol are also similar to PTSD symptoms, or maybe some kids are getting PTSD due to the long effects of cortisol in a home. I mean, it depends usually on the home and the environment and the amount of stress it's putting on the kid, but just that fact alone, to think that many people that get PTSD come from war, and to think that PTSD symptoms can be related in cortisol intake from children is kind of, it's interesting. But next is how to build better. Now, when I looked at the information, it kind of came to me like it was like a how to find one kind of thing. Just look for these emotions, or look for these certain things, and there you go. But obviously, it's a little bit more complex than that. But focusing on the observable traits like anger control and failure to communicate, like I said, there's also low self-esteem. And I guess an example of low self-esteem would be social hierarchies are changing due to women entering the workforce. So making men who have low self-esteem feel more insecure about not being able to be in control about what women can do in particular. And this increase of insecurity also can increase the level of violence, and that also plays into the ability to express their feelings, because if an abuser isn't, which they usually aren't, it's held in, and after all this negative energy is building up constantly, there's also the fact that they could have an immature personality without the ability to recognize that they're bringing themselves to that point, or recognizing that they've done something wrong so that they can change. And honestly, it makes sense that these all play into each other for an abuser to be an abuser, because it just not being able to communicate plus not being able to put any blame with the feeling of insecurity or anger control, it can be pretty rough.